Hello, everyone. Today's story is called Out of the Earth, and it is by Arthur Machen, one of my personal favorite authors. To understand this story and its context, I have to explain a little bit about Arthur Machen's life. At the beginning of this story, Arthur Machen is recounting and reflecting on a previous story which he has published, called The Bowman. The Bowman is a very short story which was published in a newspaper during the First World War. The story tells the fictional account of how retreating British soldiers were protected by a host of ghostly bowmen. Many people who read this story erroneously believed that it was actually fact and was being reported by a soldier from the front lines. Arthur Machen is responding to this situation at the start of this story, before he then goes into the real subject of the story. Listeners who are familiar with Arthur Machen will notice a few connections between this story and other stories of Arthur Machen, such as The Shining Pyramid and The Red Hand. Of course, I don't want to spoil the story for you, though, so for now, I hope you enjoy the story. Out of the Earth by Arthur Machen. Read by Connor Kay. There was some sort of confused complaint during last August of the ill behavior of the children at certain Welsh watering places. Such reports and vague rumors are most difficult to trace to their heads and fountains. None has better reason to know that than myself. I need not go over the old ground here, but I am afraid that many people are wishing by this time that they had never heard my name. Again, a considerable number of estimable persons are concerning themselves gloomily enough, from my point of view, with my everlasting welfare. They write me letters, some in kind remonstrance, begging me not to deprive poor, sick-hearted souls of what little comfort they possess amidst their sorrows. Others send me tracts and pink leaflets with allusions to the daughter of a well-known canon. Others again are violently and anonymously abusive. And then in open print, in fair book form, Mr. Begbie has dealt with me righteously but harshly, as I cannot but think. Yet it was all so entirely innocent, nay, casual on my part. A poor linnet of prose, I did but perform my indifferent piping in the evening news because I wanted to do so, because I felt that the story of the bowman ought to be told. An inventor of fantasies is a poor creature, heaven knows, when all the world is at war, but I thought that no harm would be done, at any rate, if I bore witness, after the fashion of a fantastic craft, to my belief in the heroic glory of the English host who went back from Mons, fighting and triumphing. And then, somehow or other, it was as if I had touched a button and set in action a terrific, complicated mechanism of rumors that pretended to be sworn truth, of gossip that posed as evidence, of wild taradiddles that good men most firmly believe. The supposed testimony of that daughter of a well-known canon took parish magazines by storm, and equally enjoyed the faith of dissenting divines. The daughter denied all knowledge of the matter, but people still quoted her supposed sure word, and the issues were confused with tales, probably true, of painful hallucinations and deliriums of our retreating soldiers, men fatigued and shattered to the very verge of death. It all became worse than the Russian myths, and as in the fable of the Russians, it seemed impossible to follow the streams of delusion to their fountainhead, or heads. Who was it who said that Miss M knew 2 officers who, etc., etc.? I suppose we shall never know his lying, deluding name. And so, I dare say, it will be with this strange affair of the troublesome children of the Welsh seaside town, or rather a group of small towns and villages lying within a certain section or zone, which I am not going to indicate more precisely than I can help, since I love that country, and my recent experience with the bowmen have taught me that no tale is too idle to be believed. And, of course, to begin with, nobody knew how this odd and malicious piece of gossip originated. So far as I know, it was more akin to the Russian myth than to the tale of the Angels of Mons. That is, rumor preceded print. The thing was talked of here and there, and passed from letter to letter long before the papers were aware of its existence. And here it resembles rather the Mons affair. London and Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham were muttering vague, unpleasant things, while the little villages concerned basked innocently in the sunshine of an unusual prosperity. In this last circumstance, as some believe, is to be sought the root of the whole matter. It is well known that certain East Coast towns suffered from the dread of air raids, and that a good many of their usual visitors went westward for the first time. So there is a theory that the East Coast was mean enough to circulate reports against the West Coast out of pure malice and envy. It may be so, I do not pretend to know, but here is a personal experience, such as it is, which illustrates the way in which the rumor was circulated. I was lunching one day at my Fleet Street tavern. This was early in July, and a friend of mine, a solicitor of Sergeant's Inn, came in and sat at the same table. We began to talk of holidays, and my friend Edis asked me where I was going. To the same old place, I said. Manavan. You know we always go there. Are you really? Said the lawyer. I thought that coast had gone off a lot. My wife has a friend who's heard that it's not all that it was. I was astonished to hear this, not seeing how a little village like Manavan could have gone off. I had known it for 10 years as having accommodation for about 20 visitors, and I could not believe that rows of lodging houses had sprung up since the August of 1914. Still, I put the question to Edis. Trippers? I asked, knowing firstly that trippers hate the solitudes of the country and the sea. Secondly, that there was no industrial towns within cheap and easy distance. And thirdly, that the railways were issuing no excursion tickets during the war. No, not exactly trippers, the lawyer replied. But my wife's friend knows a clergyman who says that the beach at Tremaine is not at all pleasant now, and Tremaine's only a few miles from Manavan, isn't it? In what way not pleasant? I carried on my examination. Pierrots and shows and that sort of thing. I felt that it could not be so, for the solemn rocks of Tremaine would have turned the liveliest Pierrot to stone. He would have frozen into a crag on the beach, and the seagulls would have carried away his song and make it a lament by lonely booming caverns that look on Avalon. Edis said that he had heard nothing about showmen, but he understood that since the war, the children of the whole district had gone quite out of hand. Bad language, you know, he said, and all that sort of thing. Worse than London's slum children. One doesn't want one's wife and children to hear foul talk at any time, much less on their holiday. And they say that Castel Coch is quite impossible. No decent woman would be seen there. I said, really, that's a great pity, and changed the subject. But I could not make it out at all. I knew Castel Coch well, a little bay bastioned by dunes and red sandstone cliffs, rich with greenery. A stream of cold water runs down there to the sea. There is the ruined Norman castle, the ancient church, and the scattered village. It is altogether a place of peace and quiet and great beauty. The people there, children and grown-ups alike, were not merely decent but courteous folk. If one thanked a child for opening a gate, there would come the inevitable response, "And welcome kindly, sir." I could not make it out at all. I didn't believe the lawyer's tales. For the life of me, I could not see what he could be driving at. And for the avoidance of all unnecessary mystery, I may as well say that my wife and child, and myself, went down to Machen last August and had a most delightful holiday. At the time we were certainly conscious of no annoyance or unpleasantness of any kind. Afterwards, I confess, I heard a story that puzzled and still puzzles me, and this story, if it can be received, might give its own interpretation to one or two circumstances which seemed in themselves quite insignificant. But all through July I came upon traces of evil rumors affecting this most gracious corner of the earth. Some of these rumors were repetitions of Oedipus's gossip. Others amplified his vague story and made it more definite. Of course, no first-hand evidence was available. There is never any first-hand evidence in these cases, but A knew B, who had heard from C that her second cousin's little girl had been set upon and beaten by a pack of young Welsh savages. Then people quoted a doctor in large practice in a well-known town in the Midlands, to the effect that Tremaine was a sink of juvenile depravity. They said that a responsible medical man's evidence was final and convincing, but they didn't bother to find out who the doctor was, or whether there was any doctor at all, or any doctor relevant to the issue. Then the thing began to get into the papers in a sort of oblique, by-the-way sort of manner. People cited the case of these imaginary bad children in support of their educational views. One side said that these unfortunate little ones would have been quite well behaved if they had had no education at all. The opposition declared that continuation schools would speedily reform them and make them into admirable citizens. Then the poor Arfenshire children seemed to become involved in quarrels about Welsh disestablishment and in the question of the miners, and all the while they were going about behaving politely and admirably as they always do behave. I knew all the time that it was all nonsense, but I couldn't understand in the least what it meant, or who was pulling the wires of rumour, or their purpose in so pulling. I began to wonder whether the pressure and anxiety and suspense of a terrible war had unhinged the public mind, so that it was ready to believe any fable, to debate the reasons for happenings which had never happened. At last, quite incredible things began to be whispered. Visitors' children had not only been beaten, they had been tortured. A little boy had been found impaled on a stake in a lonely field near Machen. Another child had been lured to destruction over the cliffs at Castell Coch. A London paper sent a good man down quietly to Aachen to investigate. He was away for a week, and at the end of that period returned to his office and, in his own phrase, threw the whole story down. There was not a word of truth, he said, in any of these rumours, no vestige of a foundation for the mildest forms of all this gossip. He had never seen such a beautiful country. He had never met pleasanter men, women, or children. There was not a single case of anyone having been annoyed or troubled in any sort or fashion. Yet all the while the story grew, and grew more monstrous and incredible. I was too much occupied in watching the progress of my own mythological monsters to pay much attention. The town clerk of Tremaine, to which the legend had at length penetrated, wrote a brief letter to the press indignantly denying that there was the slightest foundation for the unsavory rumors which, he understood, were being circulated, and about this time we went down to Machen and, as I say, enjoyed ourselves extremely. The weather was perfect, blues of paradise in the skies, the seas all a shimmering wonder, olive greens and emeralds, rich purples, glassy sapphires changing by the rocks, far away a haze of magic lights and colors at the meeting of the sea and sky. Work and anxiety had harried me. I found nothing better than to rest on the thymy banks by the shore, finding an infinite balm and refreshment in the great sea before me, in the tiny flowers beside me, or we would rest all the summer afternoon on a shelf high on the grey cliffs, and watch the tide creaming and surging about the rocks, and listen to it booming in the hollows and caverns below. Afterwards, as I say, there were one or two things that struck cold, but at the time those were nothing. You see a man in an odd white hat pass by and think little or nothing about it. Afterwards, when you hear that a man wearing such a hat had committed murder in the next street 5 minutes before, then you find in that hat a certain interest and significance. Funny children was the phrase my little boy used, and I began to think they were funny indeed. If there be a key at all to this queer business, I think it is to be found in a talk I had not long ago with a friend of mine named Morgan. He is a Welshman and a dreamer, and some say he is like a child who has grown up and yet has not grown up like other children of men. Though I did not know it, while I was at Machen, he was spending his holiday time at Castell Coch. He was a lonely man, and he liked lonely places, and when we met in the autumn, he told me how, day after day, he would carry his bread and cheese and a beer in a basket to a remote headland on that coast known as the Old Camp. Here, far above the waters, are solemn, mighty walls, turf-grown, circumvallations, rounded and smooth, with the passing of many thousand years. At one end of this most ancient place there is a tumulus, a tower of observation perhaps, and underneath it slinks the green, deceiving ditch that seems to wander into the heart of the camp, but in reality rushes down to sheer rock and a precipice over the waters. Here came Morgan daily, as he said, to dream of Avalon, to purge himself from the fuming corruption of the streets. And so, as he told me, it was with singular horror that one afternoon, as he dozed and dreamed and opened his eyes now and again to watch the miracle and magic of the sea, as he listened to the myriad rumors of the waves, his meditation was broken by a sudden burst of horrible raucous cries, and the cries of children too, but children of the lowest type. Morgan says that the very tones made him shudder. They were to the ear what slime is to the touch, and then the words, every foulness, every filthy abomination of speech, blasphemies that struck like blows at the sky, that sank down into the pure shining depths, defiling them. He was amazed. He peered over the green wall of the fort, and there in the ditch he saw a swarm of noisome children, horrible little stunted creatures with old men's faces, with bloated faces, and little sunken eyes, with leering eyes. It was worse than uncovering a brood of snakes or a nest of worms. No, he would not describe what they were about. Read about Belgium, said Morgan, and think They couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. There was no infamy, he said, that they did not perpetrate. They spared no horror of cruelty. I saw blood running in streams as they shrieked with laughter, but I could not find the mark of it on the grass afterwards. Morgan said he watched them and could not utter a word. It was as if a hand held his mouth tight, but at last he found his voice and shrieked at them, and they burst into a yell of obscene laughter and shrieked back at him and scattered out of sight. He could not trace them. He supposes that they hid in the deep bracken behind the old camp. Sometimes I can't understand my landlord at Castel Koch, Morgan went on. He's the village postmaster and has a little farm of his own, a decent, pleasant, ordinary sort of chap, but now and again he will talk oddly. I was telling him about these beastly children and wondering who they could be when he broke into Welsh, something like, "The battle that is for age unto ages, and the people take delight in it." So far, Morgan, and it was evident that he did not understand all. But this strange tale of his brought back an odd circumstance or two that I recollected, a matter of our little boy straying away more than once and getting lost among the sand dunes and coming back screaming, evidently frightened horribly, and babbling about funny children. We took no notice, did not trouble, I think, to look whether there were any children wandering about the dunes or not. We were accustomed to his small imaginations. But after hearing Morgan's story, I was interested, and I wrote an account of the matter to my friend, old Dr. Duthoit of Hereford, and they were only visible, only audible to children and the childlike, hence the explanation of what puzzled you at first. The rumours, how did they arise? They arose from nursery gossip, from scraps and odds and ends of half-articulate children's talks of horrors that they didn't understand, of words that shamed their nurses and their mothers. These little people of the earth rise up and rejoice in these times of ours, for they are glad, as the Welshman said, when they know that men follow their ways.